Elemental Mastery.
Elemental Mastery?
Elemental Mastery. Elemental Mastery.
Elemental Mastery?
Elemental Mastery. Elemental Mastery. Elemental Mastery.
Elemental Mastery?
Elemental Mastery.
Mastery?
Well, that didn't happen. Elemental Mastery on Geo is still garbage. Hello there, welcome to a new series that I'm planning called Reworkshop. This is a series where I dive into reworks for things that bother me in gaming that I consume, and there's a lot of things that bother me in Genshin Impact, so in this video I'm going to start with Crystalize reaction and see why it is an underutilized reaction and seeing how it can be balanced to actually be useful. Now on to the actual intro. So Genshin Impact is a game that focuses heavily on elemental combat. We all know this, whether that be with a single element or multiple elemental reactions happening at different times. There's always a meta in terms of elemental reactions, unfortunately, no matter what kind of gameplay it is. However, to have good game balance, there should be a niche for even the less potent reactions, and there just shouldn't be a lesser or worse reaction without additional effects, just having others tower over them. Over the past year of Genshin Impact, they've started to gain an identity for their lesser elemental reactions, even buffing them by a large amount since patch 1.6. God, that was a long time ago. These lesser reactions are called Transformative Reactions, and they were only called lesser since players were just used to the massive amplifying reactions of Melt and Vaporize. Oh, and these reactions could not crit, so hypothetically you would have to stack EM, Elemental Mastery, to really gain use for these reactions, but realistically, that isn't the best way to deal damage normally, even nowadays, with some exceptions. So, why don't we get started and look through these transformative reactions that are enhanced more by high Elemental Mastery stacking. Electrocharged is the first reaction, and it has its niche by being a massively AoE reaction with Hydro and Electro applications, both not leaving the target after their first application, meaning they stay on the target more often than any other reaction that just disappears. Overloaded is the next reaction, and it's become a mono-pyro staple in several characters who just have really long ICDs, or the internal elemental cooldowns, like Yoimiya, and just need a single Electro character that's off-field to apply the Electro, and then everything else can buff the Pyro DPS and the overloaded damage, which counts as Pyro damage when swirled and buffed. Overloaded also knocks back enemies and has the highest multiplier of damage, making Overloaded full EM stacking builds, like I mentioned before, decently viable on some characters, like Yanfei. Overloaded has also become surprisingly good as a reaction over the past few months since Yoimiya's release. I never doubted you, Queen. And those were just the two of the main reactions that people were overlooking for quite a while, and look where they are now. Overvape, Overloaded comps, Electrocharge Beidou comps, they've all ran rampant on Spiral Abyss, and the national team, which includes Raiden Shogun in it now, not very national, but it basically is such a good composition to destroy everything because of the crazy amount of elemental reactions going on at once. One reaction that I forgot to mention, but it's still pretty notable, is Swirl. Swirl just got buffed in 1.6, but it never really needed any changes outside of the damage. The AoE damage it can do now is insane, but it always was able to synergize with 4-piece Viridescent Venerer artifact sets to be a very big supportive reaction. Superconduct is the weakest in terms of damage, but without the need of artifacts, it also has a physical resistance shred debuff on enemies in an AoE, so it's not totally weak, just niche. Right where it needs to be. Oh, and it's also cryo damage, I don't know if that matters. Shatter... We're not going to talk about Shatter. That's a different video. If you like this video, tell me to make a Shatter video, and then I'll talk about it. But anyway, in this video, we finally talked about all of the transformative reactions that were notable and had a history with them. Ignoring Shatter, we're going to talk about Crystallize, the most underutilized elemental reaction, transformative reaction, and is regarded the worst in terms of viability. All Geo characters sneer in disgust whenever they get Elemental Mastery as a substat on their artifacts, except for Goro, because he's a good boy and I'm in denial. So I think it's quite fitting for someone who's made my place a little bit on YouTube, being a big Goro theory guy and a Husbando theory video, whatever. I thought I'd do a comeback video about Crystallize reaction being shit in Genshin Impact. Since my Goro video went well, but only a fraction of my theory sadly came true, I might as well address the ugly duckling that is Crystallize and its state in Genshin Impact. So if you like this video, give it a like. Or you can just wait until the end of the video, because that's something that people do sometimes, but like it anyway because I think it'll be a fun time, I promise. Alright, anyway, let's break down my points that I'll be making in this video. To start, let's go over Crystallize at its current state. Then, I'll briefly talk about the Geo element's identity and its path to its evolution in our current patch, which is roughly 2.5 to 2.6. And finally, I will talk about the possible rework options for Crystallize, which I think I have about 3. You can skip to the rework portion, but I would heavily recommend you listen to my context building for the rework so that things can start making sense. Alright. So, Crystallize, as we know, is pretty bad, right? But how bad? There's some good bits about Crystallize that I'll put up in the top left corner as pros, and the weaknesses in the top right corner for cons. I may not be a math guy, but here's some math for the scaling of Crystallize Shield's health, courtesy of Genshin Wiki. I've gathered a lot of my research using Genshin Wiki, so big thanks to them, or the conglomerate of many people putting their heads together and putting it in a single place. Anyway, thanks to them. As we can see here in this graph and table, the strength of Crystallize drastically increases with the level of the character that triggers Crystallize, which will always be the Geo character. This is true for all transformative reactions, but let's just focus on Crystallize here. I just find it funny how much investment needs to go into Crystallize for all of it just to be bad. Why does it have to be this bad? Too much investment for little return. EM stacking does nothing for Crystallize. The thing is, Crystallize shields, and all shields in general, factor in the current shielded character's defense stat. Did you know that? I don't know. Since, you know, the character is taking damage and it's redirected to the shield instead, based on their character's defense. This can technically make Crystallize only good for characters like, specifically Arataki Ito, Noelle, Eula, Chi-Chi, and Xinyan for main DPS examples, but not for squishy characters. Whoever has low base defense does not benefit from Crystallize very much and has to rely on big buff shields to protect them. You'll even see footage of my very heavily copium Elemental Mastery Goro on an Ito Kokumi hybrid team in the background for Spiral Abyss, and judge for yourself to truly see how this team is. So I'll put both a pro and a con for Crystallize, where it benefits high defense characters and struggles with everyone else. To be fair, if Geo were to consistently be applied and create Crystallize, it wouldn't be so bad, especially if the shield's stacked up to a certain point. Hint hint, that's one of the reworks I would make. But sadly, all of the Geo characters that can reliably do Crystallize or have high Geo application are, while off field, are only 3 characters. One is Zhongli, who doesn't even need to do any of this mumbo jumbo because his own shield is the best shield in the dang game. Another is Albedo, who was supposed to be a Crystallize support with his initial design. He was a really early character, so it makes sense. But he's not. Geo has evolved to be a big DPS element, and Albedo has the biggest off-field Geo damage in the game. And the last character is Goro, who, if you have his burst up, can reliably create a lot of Crystallize shards off-field and even pull them in. Very suspicious. But he isn't used with more than one Crystallize elemental character since he's a triple Geo buffer. So he's not really that reliable, but I use a team that includes Kokomi as your applicator for Hydro, and then Goro can crystallize her application. It kind of works, but in all actuality, Goro is not really a synergistic character for Elemental Mastery Crystallize. I know, I'm crying. What are you afraid of, Hoyoverse? Goro supremacy? Moving on. What I'm trying to say is, there's not enough Geo characters that apply Geo reliably off-field without sacrificing something. So unfortunately, that's not true. Moving on. Crystallize requires an application of an element of Cryo, Pyro, Hydro, or Electro to even function. I sort of mentioned this a little bit earlier, which, you know, most of the time, if you're not running 4-piece Petra, it's not worth having on most team compositions. Otherwise, Crystallize really only functions as an extra teeny-weeny little bit of HP if you happen to have a Geo character in your party that's not Zhongli. Heck, having any other Geo character that's not paired with another for Geo Resonance is just not worth it, unless it's Yunjin, a character that was kind of made to circumvent this issue quietly. But there's a hidden use for Crystallize that I don't think people know about. Ready for me to blow your mind? Crystallize can nullify knockback or stagger, even when the shield is destroyed. That's a pretty big deal for fights that knock you around like the Magukenki. I think this is a pro, but it's something to be explored in a rework, because there's not enough on-field or off-field Geo characters that can take advantage of this. Alright, so let's go through quickly our pros and cons before moving on about Crystallize in its current state. Pros: it's good for high defense characters, nullifies knockback even when the shield is broken, can absorb 250% more of the matching element. Cons: too much investment for too little return, EM stacking does virtually nothing for Crystallize, not enough off-field Geo application without sacrificing something, requires another element to even be created as a shield, which is not as reliable, and is only a tiny bit of extra HP with little investment. Oof, that's a lot of cons. I'd even add a con where it's not even viable to make a team out of, unless you're crazy like me and use stringless Goro. So that's it. That's the pros and cons. Pretty sad, right? I may have missed some cons, but it's already been beaten into the ground that Crystallize is bad, so let's just leave it. Don't even tell me about it. I know it's bad. So as for the Geo element as a whole and how it's changing, I mentioned it a bit ago as a couple of cons that Crystallize has, so I'm going to briefly talk about how Geo has changed and evolved since Zhongli and Albedo were the only Geo characters that defined a meta together. Geo used to be a defensive element that focused on sole defense. No offensive capabilities found here until Zhongli's rework and the Geo Resonance reworks started to pave the path for Geo supremacy, viability. With Ito and Goro's release, it shows that Geo buffs itself more than other elements, which would make you think. Geo's strengths are defensive stat focuses, defensive shields, and buffing itself with Geo damage bonuses, right? Well, not with Yunjin. Yunjin proves that Geo can buff other elements without hindering other elements. Hopefully in the future, that's what the new Geo characters will focus one or the other on. Because Yunjin is one of the best designed Geo 4-stars that has great versatility in her use. So, as a quick thought about the Geo element as a whole, that starts my whole idea for Crystallize reworking, in my opinion, the state of Geo as an element is defensive in every way, stat-wise being defense and with protection. It also buffs itself though, heavily, while also having an option to buff other elements with half efficiency or as a somewhat bonus. Remember this opinionated statement because this is what I'm going into with the reworks for Crystallize. So we're finally at the Crystallize reworks. And not at 20 minutes. Wow. We'll probably end at 20 minutes, let's be honest. But I have 3 options for a rework. A defensive option only, an offensive option, and a hybrid option. To start with the defensive rework, most of it starts with buffing the stats of Crystallize based on Elemental Mastery. This can make room for a Geo Elemental Mastery character Excuse my pain there. This one is a simple tweak of numbers. I could do my Crystallize shield stacking option, but I feel it would be too powerful even with a limit and might even replace some shielding characters. I'm going to instead add an additional effect alongside these enhanced numbers. With limited math involved, here is what my defensive number rework would be. Base HP of the shield would go up by 150 HP for each level mark, and with the scaling of Elemental Mastery, I'm not sure why it didn't get buffed alongside the other Transformative Reactions, so we'll try doing something along the lines of diminishing doubling since the scaling falls off heavily at 100 plus Elemental Mastery for some reason. So here's what it would be reworked as: 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 96, 144, 199, etc. This value could be too much, but at the same time, you're sacrificing damage for defense, and EM stacking like this could really only be used on somebody like Goro, since his buff is flat regardless of what artifacts he has, so he doesn't really need a big build to be useful. Even Yunjin can simply use an EM weapon like the Kitain Spear and still do her massive normal attack buffing using her defense, and it would be greatly beneficial. I even could have started the diminishing around the 32 mark and would have still been decent in terms of buffs, but I think it's still good since this rework is solely defense and Elemental Mastery stacking as an option. Yes, it is sacrificing damage, but here's something else. What if, instead of the matching element having a 250% damage reduction to the shield, instead make it nullify damage of that element, making you immune? And you could even have it absorb those elemental attacks as shield HP, either healing the shield or just stacking the shield infinitely as long as you're hitting the element that the shield is. Wouldn't that be cool? I think that would be cool. I could take away the absorption part if the Nullify addition is enough alongside the numbers buff, but I think that would be nice. Crystallize needs something like that. But yes, this rework is a bit of a simple one, but with less math and solely a defensive option. So this next rework option is the offensive one. So for this one, once a Crystallized shield breaks, it gives an additional lingering effect on the active character that increases that crystallized element's damage by 15% and a resistance by 20% of that element that stacks on top of the additional crystallized shield if picked up. But this effect only lasts for about 5 seconds. This promotes a constant use of Crystallize and even spacing out picking up the crystallized shards, which there's still only 3 of them, so that you can gain a nice continual buff. Well, why isn't this the hybrid effect, you may ask? Well, because the offensive buff like added damage are very offensive. I just thought it would be silly to have elemental damage bonus and not a resistance. That's it, you know? So having the resistance one kind of evens out the nice defensive utility that Crystallize should have, while also promoting active use of Crystallize for offensive buffs. Now, the hybrid rework is a very spicy one. This hybrid rework is adding a both defensive and offensive buff, and it's my favorite idea so far, but it has the most rework notes over the other 2 reworks, so pay attention or read or something. Expecting an audience to read. Firstly, Crystallize now cleanses your current afflicted element and makes it into a crystallized shard when geo damage comes in contact with your active character in an AoE. This allows you to not need an applied element on the target and makes an AoE application for geo a lot more useful to cleanse yourself, while also making Crystallize, and a more useful Crystallize at that. Secondly, Crystallized shards can now stack up to 3 levels, which means they can stack up to 3 times but reduce the effectiveness by 50% each time. So here's the shield stacking, but for example, here's what it's like. If you pick up 1 shard, it's the base shield. Remember, there's no defensive math that we did before, so it's the same base shield as we have today. But once you pick up the second shard, that base health is reduced by 15% but stacks on top of the base shield. Then the third and final shard you pick up is reduced by another 50%, which is 25% stacked on top of that. So you're almost getting a double crystallized shield, just instead 75 extra effectiveness. This gives a lot much more needed defense that needs you to keep track of crystallized shards. But I think it's more worth it because you just kind of leave them around anyway, and I think it adds a new unique mechanic that helps you in a good way. But I didn't get to my final effect yet. Here's the hybrid that really makes sense. This is the crystallized change that I've wanted for so long, and you probably have seen it somewhere in my Goro video, but I want this crystallize effect to be based on the Abyssal Moon of a very early Spiral Abyss buff, but it's slightly different, and you can see it on the screen right here. The Abyssal buff reads as follows: when a crystallize occurs, the elemental shard obtained by the character deals elemental damage to surrounding enemies. So when you pick up the shard, it deals elemental damage, no matter if you have a crystallized shard already on or you just picked up the first one. Anyway, increased damage is dealt when the shield is more powerful, basically elemental mastery stacking. Damage dealt is scaled on shield strength as well, which is kind of weird. But anyway, my additional effect for this rework tweaks this effect slightly without being a direct copy. My added change is as follows. When Crystallize occurs, the elemental shard obtained by the character deals elemental damage to surrounding enemies, and decreases enemies' elemental resistance of that element by 5% and stacks up to a maximum of 15%. This effect lasts for 3 seconds, but can be refreshed. When a crystallized shard breaks, the elemental damage is 150% greater. Increased damage is dealt when the shield is more powerful based on the crystallized reactor's elemental mastery. So this basically is the Abyssal Moon buff, but without shield strength scaling, that's wacky, and instead with elemental mastery scaling and with resistance shred of that single element. And you might be wondering, does the stacking of level 3 shields increase the power of the elemental explosion? No. Just if any level of crystallized shield breaks, it deals 150% extra damage. I'm keeping it consistent for a reason. This allows either a defensive playstyle with picking up all the crystallized shards, or just straight up explosion damage after explosion damage with a maximum resistance shred of 15%. This allows a character that's Geo to deal a nice burst of elemental damage, buffing mono element teams with Geo characters helping buff mono element teams properly, and not just having to be a Yunjin. Anyway, that's it. That's all the reworks for Crystallize that I have. Of course, I have a bias with this hybrid rework that's stacked to the brim, but I think a big rework like this is what really can fix Crystallize and help it not be niche. It would be a jack of all trades and a master of only a few, focusing only on its mono element strength and being a defensive overall boost. And in conclusion, because I know this is on some of your minds, even with this rework, this reaction will never power creep or replace Anemo Swirl Viridescent 4-piece characters. Swirl and Anemo is meant to buff and debuff multiple elements in an AoE, allowing for versatility for only one Anemo character to be used in the party. This Crystallize rework only enhances a single element that requires the main DPS's element, just like the archaic Petra 4-piece artifact bonus, with a short window. It's really not that busted, it's just good now. With this rework, you could use a single Geo character with the 4-piece Petra set, and an Anemo character with the 4-piece Viridescent set, and a buffer like Bennett, Shenhe, or Sara, and then your main DPS that simply just goes crazy with mono elemental damage. It's sort of like picking your poison with either a Geo booster or a Viridescent Anemo booster. It really just matters on your team composition, and if you stack both, you stack for mono element damage, so it's not that broken. And I guess really briefly, I think especially with Shenhe being released, we really need to enhance mono-element teams, so characters like Shenhe could actually be useful without needing constellations or anything like. Mono-element teams are one of my favorite team types, and that doesn't include Geo Unga Bunga, I swear. I sometimes just don't want to see a spiral of elemental reactions hurting my eyes, or doing a massive burst setup that requires like 1,000 seconds of setup for only 2 seconds of serotonin. I'm over-exaggerating, but also, look, I'm a Geo main, I gotta have my Geo element be just as spicy as a Nemo is. I like Unga and Bunga as much as the next guy, but I need some spice. Alright, well, that's the end of the video. For real. If this is your first video of mine, hello there. I'm Leod, and I do a lot of fun theory videos on gameplay and game design, mostly on Genshin Impact. I'm a goofball who likes to stream Genshin Impact every Tuesday at twitch.tv/udster, and I sometimes stream other games since Genshin's content is lacking for streaming more than 3 hours for 1 day a week. Anyway, if you liked the video, give it a like, and subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what you would do to the Crystalize element, or if you agreed with any of my rework ideas. With all that said, I'm no longer going to promise videos in a timely manner anymore, but they will still be a mixture of Genshin Impact and perhaps other kinds of videos in the future. So be sure to hit the notification bell to get notified whether I put up a rare video on YouTube or not. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you later. Bye.